other party will also gain from what you're trying to do, you will not gain from that relationship, right? So mutual gains is what generally creates cooperation between countries in the first place. And if countries don't have anything that they're gaining out of the UN, then they will not be a part of the UN. They will do anything else. They will do everything else that is, giving them more interest. So I think self interest is something that you will all have to sort of understand how that happens, and then understand how that self interest can change into collective interest. And I think we will be discussing that a little bit in our next segment as well, when we discuss negotiation framework. So we can go to the next slide, please. And some comments are very valid, like in the chat. Someone saying that you can't expect the developing countries to switch to renewable energy as it is more expensive, and this is exactly how the MUN operates. What you're doing when you're writing all these statements is exactly how the UN is operating. So well done, everyone. Can we just get a round of virtual applause for or hearts for everyone who's chatting in the group today? I think it'll be great to yeah. I'll also do that from my side. Okay. That's wonderful. So please continue this conversation. I trust me, I'm speaking, but I'm also reading and reading through the chat as well. So very, very enriching. Uh, so once we have understood the problem, this issue that I'm now introducing to you to, it's a very, very important one for all of you, is understanding the stakeholders. Stakeholders, whenever you are trying to address any problem whatsoever, a stakeholder analysis or understanding which are the stakeholders in a problem is possibly going to really be helpful to you. So for instance, when we look at climate change, I'd mentioned this earlier as well. Climate change is not just a problem of nations. Climate change involves businesses. Climate change involves individuals. Climate change involves nature. Climate change involves NGOs. Climate change involves sports persons, artists, right? So different stakeholders play a different role in creating the problem as well as solving the problem. Okay. And the first thing we should do once we have understood the problem is literally map them out. Map them out, and then we will see how that is helpful to us. Can we please go to the next slide? Yes. Yeah. So when we are looking at and how we map them out is someone has written the stakeholder matrix, right? So how we look at the generally a stakeholder matrix is, let me ask a question, is a simple question: who is creating the problem? Okay. So when I say who is creating the problem of climate change, uh, and then my next question is how, and I'm just typing it out on the chat for you. First question is who is creating the problem. Second is how are they creating the problem? Okay. So now the moment you ask these two questions, who is creating the problem and how are they creating the problems? Uh, you will have very interesting responses. So Navrishka has mentioned industries. Rose Singh has mentioned geoengineering. Somebody has mentioned we the people. Somebody has mentioned humans. Uh, yeah, like so. But the moment you start looking at it more deeply, you see that industries are causing the problem, but who is using the products of the industries? We are as individuals. Who is benefiting? Who is deciding the policies of for those industries? The government, right? Who is uh, who is creating all these advertising things for all of these products to be used? Another section. So what happens is that you will start seeing that it is not so simple as saying we the people or human beings. You can really start segmenting these issues, and the moment you have that segmenting happening, solutions will start automatically emerging. Because the moment you say who is creating a problem, and you say, okay, fossil fuel using industries or carbon emitting industries, you can really start looking at what is the solution for that particular group, right? Similarly, um, any other issue like whatsoever, right? Like for instance, somebody mentioned mining. Now mining is not just something that is happening on its own. Mining has so many stakeholders involved in it. Like there are people who are mining, there's a government which has agreed to let the mining happen. There is a certain set of people who are inspecting the whole process, and then letting that the regulations be faltered or not being followed very easily. There are judicial bodies which are judging on these things. So there are so many different stakeholders, and understanding each of them can lead to the next part, which is understanding the solutions. So that is very important. And then another issue is, let's say, who can solve the problem, like that. So now we can do a stakeholder analysis on the solutions front as well, and then the next question can be, how can they solve the problem? Our immediate next question is, why have they, if you start thinking about it, why have they not done what they are supposed to do, right? And finally, what can the UN do to get them to do what they are supposed to do? So if you ask these four, five, if you ask this series of questions, you will be able to very, very easily move from the solution front, like from the questions front to the solutions front. And I think this brings tangibility. When we say tangibility, it means that we move beyond the slogans. We actually start moving to who needs to do what, how do they need to do it, by when do they need to do it. A lot of this I will be covering in my next session as well, when we look at the problem solving components. But for all of you, stakeholder mapping, I would say, is a very, very important exercise. Okay, now looking at the solutions, so you start asking these solutions, you start finding these solutions through your research, and then start looking at, are there some existing solutions already? Like, for instance, when you look at Montreal Protocol for ozone layer preservation, it gives a very, very beautiful framework. And then you will see that time and again they will update it. The countries update it as far as the new requirements are concerned. So it's not always about creating a new solution in an MUN or the UN. It's sometimes about just doing the right thing that was previously agreed to. Um, Trying to see that is there something that can enable the existing solutions more. Like for instance, earlier we did not have so much technology with us. So now, can we leverage technology to make things possible which weren't happening earlier? I'll give you one example, like from India, that in India, what used to happen was that Indian government used to give subsidies to poor people for food and all of those issues. Now there was a lot of corruption in that system. The one thing that really changed it was technology. The moment technology came, all those that transfer of money became online, and because that became online, it became completely open to transparency. Like people could check the transactions, where they had gone, and so on. And all of a sudden that changed everything about the whole policy. So sometimes what may not have been possible 10 years ago becomes more possible today, simply because some new factor has come in, and in this case, as I was mentioning, was technology. So you can start thinking about a lot of these issues as well. Uh, and these are some of the ways in which you can look at the solutions. Then you can also look at, like for instance, if we have Paris Agreement, somebody had talked about Paris Agreement earlier. Paris Agreement was signed, agreed in 2015 between all the countries that this is what we are supposed to do. The moment you have been allocated a country, you need to start looking at a simple question: what are my country's commitments towards Paris Agreement? Have we fulfilled that or not? Are we on track of fulfilling that or not? If we are not on track, then why are we not on track? Uh, what is it that is preventing us from being on track? Is it something that is an intention based issue, or is it something that's a challenge based issue? If you are facing a challenge and you still really want to address it, then you come to the UN, discuss that challenge, and find support in that challenge, in fulfilling that, in overcoming that challenge. Okay. So like I said, you have to ask so many questions more than the answers. Okay. So learn like to start approaching these issues with a lot of questions rather than the answers. And the more questions you can ask, the trust me, the more solutions and the more answers you will be able to find. But you have to be open to that approach as well. Okay. Now let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. International law. So now finally we are looking at how international law operates. And once I finish the international law section, I will be coming to the chat as well. Again, some really interesting things are happening in the chat, so I'm going to refer back to all the comments that you're talking about. Uh, International law is an important component. We had also discussed international law in our first session, but today we will look at it from a research perspective. And international law basically also means uh, A, what are the laws that are applicable to different countries? But B, what all duties have they already signed up with? So like Paris Agreement, Montreal Protocol, what are you supposed to do? What are you not supposed to do? This is an important component of international law. But another part of international law that you can always think about is what we call as principles. Okay. Principles, one example I can already talk about as far as climate change is uh, concerned is what we call as polluter pays principle. How many of you, if you know a polluter pays principle, like I'd love for you to just put it in the chat what you think it means, or even if you don't know and you hear this word for the first time, polluter pays, like what it means to you, right? So for different fields of international law, there are different principles that you can always read about. Um, and a lot of them they tie into each other. Like for instance, climate change is a human rights issue. The moment you start thinking about climate change from a human rights perspective, you can start researching about what are the human rights, important international laws within human rights that can help us strengthen our case for climate action as well. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And also, in the meantime, uh, I'd love for you to put in the chat what are the different international laws you may be aware of that you may have heard about. So, anything that you have heard about international law, I'd love to hear from you in the chat as well. Yeah. Okay. So so one of you have written that is it people taking responsibility for their pollution? Yes. Yes, you can say that making individuals or companies accountable for pollution. Uh, that's a very interesting question somebody has asked. People taking responsibility for their pollution. What does that mean? Does it mean that you're paying taxes? Somebody is trying to say that that means paying up for the pollution. This is very interesting. Like I'd love for you to keep putting these comments and like what comes to your mind in chat. Like how do you how do you pay? Do you only pay like money, or are you supposed to do some action, or will it include some penalties? Um, let's we can take an example of a oil spill, for example. or carbon emissions, how do you think like international law should treat all of these issues? And same with technologies. Like I think when we look at international law and green technologies, there's a very important part of intellectual property that is always governing technology. That means that if I have developed a particular technology, imagine that can have a huge impact on combating climate change, but I don't want to share it with other countries, with other companies. Can I do that? Do I have the intellectual property for that or not? Can somebody force Tesla uh, into giving their intellectual property to other companies to manufacture more electric vehicles, right? Or can you take proprietary technology, which means that a technology which is owned by somebody uh, for the good of the people to other people, right? So how do you think international laws around technology should be uh, to benefit the planet? And why do you think it should be like? So I'm asking you, as I said, a lot of questions, and I'd love for you to just put in any thoughts that are coming to your mind. Uh, so somebody has said sharing technologies, but the question will be, why should I share my technology with you, right? Why should I work so hard on my technology for which I from which I can profit immensely, and why will I just share my technology with somebody, and why will I not charge you adequate money for that technology, right? Uh, so so again, like you need to start thinking about a lot of these, right? Okay. Now, while you're all putting those responses in chat, uh, I'm going to just read out few of the things which are on our slide. So, sources of international law. So, when you're researching about international law, the first thing that you should remember is that there are four spaces, four places, sources which give us international law. Okay. The first one is what we call as treaties and conventions. So, these are formal agreements. So like in the slide, we've talked about Paris Agreement, we've talked about Montreal Protocol, we've talked about Kyoto Protocol, we've talked about Geneva Convention. So these are all formal documents, formal treaties that countries have signed. Uh, the second is what we call as customary international law. So this is things that countries have been practicing for a while as customs, and they have then been recognized they have been recognized as binding on people because it is now recognized as a customary international law. So that is the second way of customary, like that is the second source of international law. The third is what we call as the general principles. And I'd already talked about principles. As one example I gave you was the polluters pay principle. um, so those are also there. And the final is what we call as judicial decisions. So like you have the International Criminal Court, you have the International Court of Justice, you have something called as the International Tribunal on the Convention on Law of the Sea. So they give you judgments on matters related to the law of the sea, which talks about maritime security, like how ships are supposed to operate and all of that. So these are the four different sources of international law. um, let's go to the next slide, please. And there are, as we have said now, seven different areas for international law. Please remember that although the discussion we are having today is on climate change, but you have to also remember that at the same time, the research methodologies that I'm sort of discussing with you apply to literally any field whatsoever. That is why we are having a wider discussion on all of these issues rather than just in climate change. So you have the human rights law, you have that looks at the rights and freedoms of individuals at international level. Then you have something called as humanitarian law, which looks at what happens when there is a war-like situation and what are the rights of the people. So please remember, sometimes we confuse like human rights law with humanitarian law. They are different laws, and they have different implications on people. So it's very important to read about these. Third is what we know as international criminal law. So, like what we've already talked about, I think a lot of you in previous sessions talked about the Israel-Palestine situation. So, war crimes, genocide, those kind of situations are addressed by the criminal law. Then we have trade law. So trade law is looking, the World Trade Organization looks into it. So when we look at trade, it's also trades of goods as well as services. So that means that the whole intellectual property issue will come in the trade law component. Okay. Then you have the environmental law. So environmental law again can be about pollution, climate change, biodiversity. Then you have the law of the sea, as which I was talking about, which looks at territorial waters, navigation, how marine resources need to be exploited, so all of that, and finally diplomatic and consular law. So things like how your visas are issued, what is the protection of ambassadors, how do you treat like diplomatic staff, and all of that. So these are like 7 different areas of international law that we should like look into. Now let us look at the next section. Next slide, please. Uh, and again, like this is a very important part that international law that we have discussed so far basically gives what the law is, but its enforcement and compliance happens uh, through international tribunals, international courts, these different organizations, as International Court of Justice and in ICC, the International Criminal Court. You may have already heard a lot about them. But besides that, there are several also tribunals. You have, for instance, the Piracy Court, which exists. I think it's in Mombasa in Kenya. You have the European Human Rights Court is there. So many different mechanisms that are there, um, where international law is then applied on countries. Okay, next slide. Right. Okay. So these are some of the international laws that we are looking at. The first, as we are talking about, is human rights and humanitarian law. Remember that you don't have to remember everything. Like you don't have to know everything about this. This is just to help you understand broadly how laws operate. Okay, so this is not to tell you that you should remember everything, although the more you know, the better. So, like the first one is Universal Declaration on Human Rights. I strongly recommend all of you to read this one. This is the very, very important one. Then you have something called as the ICCPR, which is the Covenant on Civil Political Rights. Another very important one is the the Convention on Rights of Children, CRC 1989. Very, very important. The next one is again, some of you were talking about gender-based violence. If you are interested in that, you should definitely read about this law called CEDAW, which is Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Very, very important laws. Okay. Uh, I'll before I go further, let me take these couple of questions. Are there space laws? Yes, there is a convention on outer space as well. And the second is, are there laws about testing of nuclear weapons? Yes, there are. And that will be in our next slide also. But before I go there, I want to also let me tell you another couple of laws that you should definitely look into is the Geneva Convention 1949. Very important. And then the next one is what you call a genocide convention. So in the Israel-Palestine case that is going on in the International Court of Justice right now, South Africa, in fact, initiated the case under this 1948 convention. So you should know this, very important. Then the Refugee Convention 1951. This all those people who are refugees right now, they are covered and protected by this convention. But here is my important question and observation to you. So far, the refugee situations that we have seen have arisen out of conflicts, have arisen out of political persecution. But because of climate change, now we will have several cases of climate refugees. My question, and you should read about it, and possibly in our journals, in the on our course website, write about it. Which is the international? Does the International Law Refugee Convention cover climate refugees? Right? Does it cover them or not? Is there any international law which gives you a human rights protection against climate change? I think these are questions which we need to start thinking about. The second section of our here, as you see, is the environment and climate change. I would highly recommend you to please read these conventions when you find the time. So Kyoto Protocol we've already talked about. Paris Agreement we have already talked about. Biological diversity, very important once again. So it talks about how do you use conserve biodiversity. Basel Convention, looking at hazardous waste and their disposals. And finally, the one that we talked about, that is the Montreal Protocol, 1987. So these are all very important climate related laws. I just Google search them, like Chat GPT search them, and just see the highlights of these. Very important. Uh, Okay, so a couple of questions from the chat. Are there laws when countries test their nuclear weapons? Yes, and you will see them in the next slides. Can you give an example of climate refugees? Climate refugees. If you want an example, there are so many people who are now being displaced from their own places in climate change, and those are what we call as climate refugees. I can tell you right now, there is no clear international law on climate refugees properly. Uh, because it is yet to be put in the international law. It has not been written yet. Maybe one exercise we can think about is, let's read the UN refugee convention and then let us try to write what kind of a convention should we have for climate refugees. That is something we can try to think about ourselves together also. I think that will be a great exercise. If you are interested to do that, you can indicate that through some emoticons, through some reactions. And if you are interested to do that, maybe that is something we can all think about as an assignment together. So I see one thumbs up here. So whoever thumbs up was there, I'll be happy to work with you on this. Okay. Now moving forward, since we only have 10 minutes left in our session, uh, someone was talking about the nuclear weapons. So as we see the point three, the first convention, non-proliferation treaty, which is NPT, very important, pertains to that particular component that you of nuclear weapons. Chemical weapons convention, biological weapons convention, they look at your chemical and biological weapons. Uh, then the next one is what we call as the next two are very important. They are called as the test ban treaties, partial and comprehensive. So they are looking at the use of the testing of nuclear weapons specifically. And earlier that you see, 1963, we had the partial test ban treaty, which said that you can't have nuclear weapons being exploded in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. What India did was they dug a big giant hole and they tested the nuclear weapon below the ground. And because of what India did, UN was compelled to then create the next convention, which was Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. That they said, okay, now instead of partial ban, a comprehensive ban. So that is why knowing international laws is very important. Then looking at the UN chart, point four, which is the UN Charter, Rome Statute, is the one for the International Criminal Court. UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I will also recommend you to read through this. This looks into everything about how ships go from one place to the other and all of that. Um, Now let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is now the concluding section of our discussion. So the first one is what we call as building a negotiation framework. Now, what that means is, once we have done research on all these three components, the first three components, we understand very well about the UN. We understand, we have a very specific viewpoint of our country. And the second is, and the third is knowing very well about the agenda. Once you have all of that, you can already start understanding. You have the foundation laid out to develop a negotiation framework for yourself. Now, before I go there, let me just before I go anywhere, David, is it fine if we can take a 5 minute extension today because of the disruptions that we had earlier?
Yes, Keshav, we can do that, no problem.
Okay, okay. Thank you everyone for being patient. We'll just take maybe 5 extra minutes today. Uh, so one question that is there is why the US has nuclear weapons, but Iran and North Korea, why can't they have nuclear weapons? Okay. So when you look at this convention, which is the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that has a that has a specific provision that allows the permanent five members of the UN to retain nuclear weapons and for the others to not have nuclear weapons. That is the reason why US can have nuclear weapons and the other countries cannot. But let me tell you that countries which highly disagree with this whole policy, which want to retain nuclear weapons, then they don't sign the NPT itself. Like India and Pakistan are two examples of countries which have refused to sign the NPT uh, for that reasons. Okay, and one another example of where that I can give you is, for instance, the Ukraine. I think Ukraine signed the NPT sometime in 1994 or much earlier, and then they destroyed all their nuclear weapons. But today they are saying that if we had the nuclear weapons, then maybe we wouldn't be in this situation where Russia is intervening in our own country. So some countries have these kind of apprehensions due to which they don't want to sign the NPT. And that logic extends to any other international law as well. Uh, yeah. The recordings of both the previous classes are available on the course platform itself. There's a recording section that you can refer to. I think that you can easily get those, and the emails have also been sent where the recording links are there. Okay, so let me now very quickly come back to building a negotiation framework. This is very important. The first thing that we need to do is understand your country's interest in the agenda. So, what will benefit our country the most? With that, we have to have a clear goal that in this meeting, this is what we would like to achieve from the whole conversation. That creates what we call as your initial position, and that initial position you can communicate in your opening statements in the MUN and the general speakers list that we had talked about last session as well. So that is your initial position. The second is, now other countries may also have similar initial positions, and trust me, like most countries, they come prepared with their initial position. So you have to start identifying allies who have a similar position with you. Okay, so that is what you mean by identifying allies who can naturally just come and work with you because they are already benefiting with you, so they are willing to work with you collaboratively and they have a similar position. I've written a note at the bottom here which says that maybe some countries you share some historical relations with. That may not be the same thing as having the similar, position on the agenda. So that is where you need to examine very carefully which country has a similar position as yours, and and that is how you can do that. Okay, yeah, BRICS, like for example, very nice example, somebody has written BRICS. India, South Africa are very good relations. And India, US has good relations. For instance, Russia, China have good relations together. So that way you have to understand which are the countries with which your allies are there. Okay, next slide please. Yes. Now, once you have developed an initial position and you have identified the parties which are uh, similar to yours, you have to identify the neutral parties as well as the competing interests. So that means that maybe there are some countries which are neutral on the agenda, and with your diplomacy skills, you can get them to your side as well. Okay. So that is a very, very important way of identifying neutral parties and building alliances with them as well, because your natural allies will stay with you. Your competing interest will not come with you, But the neutral parties have the greatest scope of movement towards the other side or your side. And that is where your skill of diplomacy can be utilized the most. Okay. Intuitively, we always want to first engage with people who are friendly with us and people who are opposite us. But I will also argue that before you go to competing interest, find people who can already who are on a neutral place and you can work with them. Third is then understanding the competing interests. So that is where you need to see what is the interest of the other people who are not partnering with you, why that is there. So what is the foundation of that interest, what is the motivation behind that interest, and is there a way in which some favorable negotiation can still take place with them. So what is it that is there a mutual win there, is there a win-win situation with them that you can find. Okay, these are very important questions you need to ask and think about when you're building your negotiation framework. We have next slide, please. Yeah, okay. Then you have two very important points, that is setting the scope of your negotiation framework. That means the first thing you need to think about in that is firstly, from your initial position, how flexible can you be? Maybe there are some issues in which countries have zero flexibility, like Israel Palestine. Countries which have aligned with Palestine and countries which have aligned with Israel, no matter what is happening, they're not changing their position. And you have seen like 40,000 people have died, but people have not changed their position. People are still there. So that is lack of flexibility. But on another issue, for another gain, possibly a country may be willing to change their position. So you have to understand the scope of deviation. Like how much should you as a country be able to deviate from your initial position, and what is the benefit of that deviation for you? And the same for other countries. The moment you see that, you can then see wherever there is scope for more deviation, with those people you can have better negotiations and more successful negotiations. Wherever there is rigidity and people don't want to negotiate, uh, then there's you're just wasting your time with them in terms of your negotiation. And yeah, being a skilled negotiator is very, very important. Setting the red lines, as I said, what is something that is absolutely non-negotiable. Okay. Let's go to the next slide, please, and we'll just take 6 more minutes to wrap up our session. Okay. Now, so far, what I've told you is how do you research? What is your approach? Now, I'm just telling you about the different sources which you are using for your research. So the first is what we call as valid sources. Valid sources means that if you quote these particular sources in the MUN, then no one can dispute these sources particularly, and people are compelled to accept those sources. So first is the UN websites. So within UN websites, you have all these official documents of the UN, which are different annual reports of UN bodies, UN resolutions, statements by UN officials, thematic reports. So maybe specific reports on climate change, then that UNFCCC issues, voting records. So, different resolutions, countries vote. So even those records are available at the UN. Meeting records. So like who said what in particular meetings. VNR is what you call as a voluntary national review. So this is the statement of sustainable development goals progress that your country submits to the UN. Texts of international treaties. So all the laws we have talked about, their texts. UN news centers. So UN has a news center. Judgments of the courts and tribunals. So these are all the things that you can easily, this is all open information. You don't have to pay a single penny to get this information. They're all available online for you. So this is from where you can read a lot of things. Then the second is the government websites. So when you look at the government websites, you have the national government website. So that is like the South Africa website, right? Then you will have probably a website of the province or a state you're in. Like for South Africa, maybe like, your KwaZulu Natal might have like one website. Uh, Websites of ministries. So like different ministries, like health ministry will have its own website. Power ministry will have its own website. Water will have its own website. So you can easily like search for information on these places. Then comes very interesting things, embassies. So many countries have different websites of their own embassies. Like Indian embassy to South Africa will have its own website. So anything that India is doing in South Africa, hopefully it is available on that particular website. Then there is something very important called country's mission to the UN. So for instance, the South African government will have an office at New York at the UN headquarters that is called as South African Mission to the UN. They have their own website, and the beauty of that website is all statements that your ambassador is going to make at the UN, they probably are all compiled there. All press releases are there, so you can easily find that information. Census results. So, census is the surveys that you have in different countries. That is something you can find. Official statements of leaders of your country and official media agencies. Uh, on the issue of misinformation, please remember that these are all official sources that we are discussing here. So this is why at least the first two you can just reliably put your reliable sort of reliance on them without any problem. So that is, and even the third one, that is data from European Union, NATO, G20, African Union, and similar groups. Uh, so that is something where your sources of information are always considered valid. Media agencies that we have talked about is UN news, press releases, and official media agencies of the countries, and media agencies prescribed by the Model UN. So many Model UN conferences, they prescribe Reuters as one media agency that is sometimes used. Now, let me just refer to this one important conversation, this comment which is there uh, about the bias in the information. Remember, everyone, that an MUN conference where you are representing a particular country, it has to be a biased narrative that you have to give, that is the bias towards your own country, right? You can't go in an MUN and say that I will give unbiased information because I am the seeker of truth. You are not the seeker of truth, sadly, in an MUN. You are the ambassador of a particular country. That has to give very specific statements that benefits your own country, which is why, sadly, a lot of information that you will see in the UN, which comes from different countries, is obviously biased from that country's perspective, because that is the very job of that ambassador. I hope that that makes sense to you from an MUN perspective. The moment you're outside that framework, of course, like truth is what is important, right? So I'm again mentioning all of this from a very specific MUN perspective. Now let's go to the last slide for today. Okay. So the last slide for today is as I said, the previous slide was sources of research for valid sources. The second is for perspective building. So this means that these are the sources which you can use to understand the issue at large, not just from your country's perspective, but at large. Okay. So the first is media. So popular media agencies of different countries. And again, I have already talked, like as you said, I'm trying to put that exact same issue in with that in my slide as well. That please remember to fact check the reports as well as understanding the ideological biases of these media agencies. So this is exactly like what some of you have already mentioned in the chat. I'm so happy of reading those comments. Um, now, one word that I want to introduce you is what we call as corroboration. Okay, so corroboration. Corroborating your sources can be very important. Like what I do usually is if I'm reading a newspaper or a particular issue, what I try to do is I try to read the same issue in five different newspapers. Like I would read Al Jazeera, I would read CNN, I would read an Indian national newspaper, I would read an African paper, I would read a European paper, and then I will read all of them and then try to come up with a understanding of the issue rather than relying on one particular news agency. And I think that is something that you can try to do. Read multiple sources. Okay. The second is international journals. So many universities have uh, many universities have international journals on global politics, international law, governance, and public policy. You can try to read through. different sources as well. So these will help you understand the issue at large, like the academic aspects of the issue. While you read about the UN, you read from the UN and all of those perspectives. And the final is books and publications by leading scholars, journalists in that area of operation. So if you have a leading scholar on that issue who you know has written some respected work, peer reviewed, so you can read through those components as well. Okay, so this is all about the research that I wanted to cover with you today. uh, we can just remove the slides for now. David, thank you. So just very quickly recapping with everyone, we have discussed four things today. uh, Knowing about the UN and the UN system at large, one. Secondly, developing a viewpoint of from your country's perspective. Thirdly, understanding the entire issue, from problems, solutions, stakeholders of the issue, who benefits how, your country's interest. And finally, developing a negotiation framework based on all that information for yourself, as to what your interest is, identifying your allies, understanding competing interests, looking at neutral parties, and then starting the negotiation. Okay, so this is what we have done, and today then we discussed a little bit on what kind of sources we can utilize. When we are meeting in the next session, we will be looking at how we use all of this in terms of problem solving. How do we write a resolution? How do we use this stakeholder identification to move from problems to solutions and writing those solutions? So once again, let me thank all of you. Once again, very, very interesting discussion in the chat. Thank you, everyone. If I can do that through reactions, and like, let's clap for everyone in the session today, if possible, through our reactions. And I'm very sorry for my technical challenges that I faced today. And thank you to David for all the management you have done with my challenges. Just one thing I would also remind you is that one interesting idea that emerged today is, can we together write a refugee convention for climate? I think that's a very interesting prospect. And I will discuss it with Denzel and the team. And maybe we can take that on as a challenge together. Uh, okay, so with that, I'll say goodbye to you and over to David, please.
All right, thanks, Kashyap. Yes, a little bit of a challenge today, but we got through it. So thank you guys also for staying online with us. I just want to remind everybody, I just want to quickly share with you. So if you go to the ADOF site, so it's adof.unisa.ac.za, you'll scroll down a little bit and you'll see there is the United Nations, the MOOC, the model. So if you click on it, you will be asked to log in, or if you want, you can just say continue. If you are a staff or a student, you can just say yes. Otherwise, you can say no and create yourself a profile. And of course, it uses your My Life login. So basically exactly the same thing you would normally use, logging to My UNISA or any of the UNISA resources. All right, so then just remember, guys, you can work through it. So please do. There is a reflective journal. I see lots of students are posting on it. So please go ahead. Complete the entire course. It's over here, all the sections that we're covering tonight and what we've covered previously. And you'll see right at the bottom, you will see there's an evaluation form. So once you completed the entire course, please make sure you do that. And of course, the biggie, the recordings. So we do put them here. You'll see under web recordings and presentations, this is where you will find it, because I know students love to ask this. So please don't forget that. So yep, get over to the ADOF site and you guys can engage all the materials there. And we will be back same time next week for the final session to wrap up everything that we've covered. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it. It's really fun, and I love seeing the chat that you guys are engaging with. And I know it's getting towards exam time, so please do study hard and make sure you nail those exams. Thank you once more, and we'll see you guys again next week. All the best.